Behind the scenes, Pat Morita's journey was anything but calm. Before his passing, the man who brought Mr. Miyagi to life finally broke his silence, revealing what really unfolded on set. It wasn't just about lines, kicks, or crane stances. It was about battles no camera ever showed. What truth did he carry all those years? And why did he wait until the end to share it? The wall before Miyagi. When people think of the Karate Kid, they immediately picture Mr. Miyagi, the quiet handyman with a wise gaze, clipped words, and a gentle strength that carried Daniel LaRusso through his most difficult trials. But what most fans never realized until Pat Morita himself spoke up years later is that the man who became Miyagi rarely got the chance. In fact, one of the most powerful voices in Hollywood at the time was determined to keep him away from the role entirely. Pat Morita had been known primarily as a comedian. Audiences remembered him for lighthearted appearances on television, quick one-liners, and an ability to deliver humor with timing that felt effortless. To many executives, that resume made him the last person who could convincingly portray a war-hardened, emotionally scarred mentor. When the role of Mr. Miyagi first came up in casting sessions, Morita's name floated into the room only to be swatted away by producer Jerry Weintraub. Weintraub, a major figure in the business, reportedly snapped that he didn't want a comic anywhere near this part. He wanted gravitas, a heavyweight, someone who could make audiences believe in a man who carried both tragedy and wisdom in silence. That was the wall, and for weeks that wall stayed firm. Every time Morita's name appeared on a list, Weintraub rejected it. To him, America was full of actors who could fit the bill better. The producers and casting directors searched everywhere else, flipping through headshots, calling in actors who looked the part, sounded the part, or at least carried the pedigree Weintraub wanted. Pat Morita? Not even considered for a reading. But here's where fate began to twist. Director John Avildsen, who had already proven his eye for underdog stories with Rocky, was not interested in following the same beaten path. He understood that the success of the Karate Kid depended on more than physical fights or training montages. It required a bond between mentor and student that felt raw and human, and he didn't want to leave a single stone unturned. Avildsen insisted that every possible candidate should be read, whether or not Weintraub approved. Pat Morita would later reflect on how surreal it felt to be included in that whole cattle call process. By the time his chance came, he was the last of the actors brought in, almost an afterthought. And the irony was not lost on him. The actor so completely dismissed by the producer was now being seen because the director refused to give up. That moment, for an actor whose career had been relegated to years of bouncing from small TV bits to stand-up gigs, this was bigger than just an audition. It was an unexpected chance at a role that everyone else seemed dead set on keeping from him. To Morita, it was proof of how unpredictable Hollywood could be. One day after wrapping, when rejection might quietly open a door the next day. Way back when, with everyone loving Miyagi, people might forget that there was once a time, however brief, when the air itself was thick with palpable tension during casting talks. Morita, however, would never forget it. He spoke openly, later in life, about the close brush with destruction that Weintraub's camp nearly handed the project before it even started. It was the very stubbornness of John Avildsen that Morita credited for having changed the course of his entire career. This tells us more than just another behind-the-scenes feud. It tells us just how very fragile the making of film legends can be. One producer's momentary judgment, one executive's disregard, that one instant made all the difference. If Avildsen hadn't put his foot down, Morita might never have entered that audition room. And without Morita, the Karate Kid would not be the same story we all knew. The wall he finally found himself facing would prove an unyielding one in his artistic endeavors, whereby, as Pat himself would cheekily opine over the years, walls ought to be scaled or chopped through. Not long thereafter, he found himself on another very contrasting ground, but not one even an audience member would remotely associate with the polished clown they remembered. Because the man who walked into that audition room wasn't the slick comedian from TV. He was a bearded, tired figure fresh from Hawaii, someone even he barely recognized in the mirror. Hawaii, beard, and fate. By the early 1980s, Pat Morita's career was drifting into uncertain waters. He had tasted fame before, from stand-up clubs to sitcoms like Happy Days. But the offers had slowed, and the spotlight felt like it was slipping away. Instead of chasing roles in Hollywood, he found himself in Hawaii, piecing together a living through whatever work came his way. Emceeing political fundraisers, writing copy for commercials, and performing in nightclubs. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't steady, but it kept the bills paid. To outsiders, it looked like Marita's career was gently fading. To him, it felt like he was treading water, waiting for something unseen. And then came a decision that changed his image completely. For the first time in his life, he let himself grow out his hair and beard. Not for a role, not for a show, simply because he felt like trying something different. Pat later laughed about it, saying he looked more like a hippie than an actor. But at the time, he didn't care. He wasn't chasing casting directors or worried about looking camera-ready. He was simply living, letting his appearance reflect the more uncertain, unpolished chapter he was in. That beard, scruffy, unusual for him, would prove to be a stroke of fate. He didn't know it then, but when the chance finally came to audition for the Karate Kid, that look helped create the impression of a weathered man who had lived through hardship. It made him appear older, wiser, and more grounded than the comedian audiences were used to seeing. What started as a personal choice soon became an unplanned gift to his career. Pat had long accepted that silence had become the theme of his life. In truth, when his contract with his agent came up, he almost thought of letting it expire. But he thought again and was affording his agent a kind of half-hearted reappointment. What the hell? Thus, one afternoon, he left his agent's office convinced that no jobs awaited him and ready to return to Hawaii. This was when fate intervened with a loud shout. A loud voice had bellowed from above, "Pat Morita!" The secretary ran out, shouting that he had just walked out the door. The agent leaned out and waved him back urgently. "Pat, get your butt back in here. There's a script I think is perfect for you." The script was The Karate Kid. It is the kind of story that seems too neat for Hollywood. Someone ought to write a movie about destiny. Marita later recounted that it felt more like a surreal moment. There he was, standing with one foot out, waiting to travel out of Los Angeles and accepting that nothing was waiting for him here. And then, almost like some last-minute interception, the script fell on him. He read it. He liked it. He agreed to audition for John Avildsen. At that point, it didn't feel like the change of life. A mere opportunity, another room, yet another director. But then the timing, the beard, and the coincidence of being ushered back in the door just at that moment. All began to make way for a greater scheme. When Marita talked about this incident back in hindsight, he spoke about it with a sense of reverence, with the thought that perhaps some invisible hand had pushed him back into the way he was supposed to go. Had he not been in Hawaii, he would not have looked like Miyagi. Had he not re-signed with his agent, there would have been no script for anyone to present him with. Had he not shuffled his feet on the sidewalk that day, fortune may have passed him by. All those little decisions, accidents, and twists converged into one open door. To audition for a role the producers had never wanted him to read for. And when he finally walked into that audition room, what he found wasn't a table of executives or a panel of judges. It was one man strapped to a camera, watching him through the lens. Avildsen's one-man camera test. When Pat Morita finally got his chance to read for The Karate Kid, he expected the usual Hollywood setup. A casting assistant, a producer scribbling notes, maybe even a writer in the corner, everyone waiting to judge his every word. Instead, he walked into a nearly empty room and straight into one of the strangest auditions of his career. Sitting there was John Avildsen, the director who had already carved his name into film history with Rocky. But Avildsen wasn't sitting casually behind a desk or flipping through a script. He was half man, half machine. On one side of his body, he cradled a camera. On the other hand, he carried the bulky battery pack strapped against his torso. He introduced himself warmly, but he never lowered the camera. From the moment Marita stepped in, he was being filmed. Marita would later joke that his first impression of Avildsen was that of a half-man, part director, part recording device. But beneath the humor was a serious point. Avildsen wanted to see more than just a polished read. He wanted to capture the raw presence of the man in front of him, to see if Pat could be Miyagi when no one else believed he could. "Tell me a little about yourself," Avildsen said. still peering from behind the lens. And so Pat spoke. Not in rehearsed lines, but in stories about his life, his career, his ups and downs. In that moment, he wasn't auditioning in the traditional sense. He was opening a window into who he really was. And Avildsen kept rolling. Then came the script. Pat was not going to reel off a safe line or two for the toughest of scenes. Ones that had not yet been staged, choreographed, or anything else for that matter. He improvised, leaning into the emotional weight with everything he had as Miyagi, without sets, costumes, or another actor to play off. As he finished, he merely expected a polite thank you and dismissal. Instead, as he started to walk away, Avildsen called, "Pat, don't you want to take your script with you? You might need it." That one sentence was electrifying. It was the first time Marita sensed that perhaps, just perhaps, he had broken through the wall of doubt surrounding him. He had walked in as a comedian with a beard. He walked out as someone who could very well have become Mr. Miyagi against all odds. Avildsen had already made up his mind. Later in meetings, when the producers were arguing over possible casting choices, he would show that tape again. One time, in a heated discussion, he just clicked on the monitor while they were in production. The meeting quieted down as Marita's audition appeared on the screen. Then Weintraub, the very one who had refused to even consider him, exclaimed, "Hey, wait a minute, that looks like Miyagi." Avildsen turned calmly and said, "That's the Pat Morita you refused to read for the part." The tape did verify that Marita could act. It verified that he was Miyagi in a way that no one else was. It was the crack that started to erode the wall of resistance. Of course, Hollywood is not one to give anything up without a rub. Even when Avildsen's tape was impressive, Marita was called back time and time again. They were producers and wanted to be sure. Could he repeat the performance? Could he do it in costume? Would he be able to hold his own beside Ralph Macchio? Marita delivered. Again. In time, the doubt lessened. But it all started from that one camera test when Pat Morita faced not a panel of skeptics but the attentive gaze of a director who believed in the capture of truth onto film. And soon, the tests wouldn't just be about him. They would put him side by side with a young actor from New York to see if a real bond could spark between student and teacher. 5 tests, 1 chemistry for most actors, 1 solid audition is enough to secure a role. For Pat Morita, it took 5. Even after John Avildsen's tape won over skeptics, the producers wanted more. They needed to be certain that the man they had dismissed as a comic could embody the soul of Mr. Miyagi. And so began a grueling gauntlet of tests. 5 separate sessions designed to prove whether Pat Morita could not only act the part but live it. The first 2 tests were simple reenactments. Could he recreate the same intensity and subtlety from his initial audition? Could he tap into the quiet authority of Miyagi without slipping into humor or parody? Each time, Morita delivered. He carried himself with dignity, spoke with weight, and showed flashes of vulnerability that hinted at Miyagi's deeper story. But the third test raised the stakes. This time, Ralph Macchio flew in from New York. The producers needed to know, could the chemistry between Daniel LaRusso and Mr. Miyagi feel real? The script called for a bond that was more than teacher and student. It was father and son, mentor and guide. If Morita and Macchio didn't connect, the entire film would crumble. Initially, they would read together. Just simple dialogues, then into dramatic materials. The wax-on, wax-off moments, full soul-bearing confessions, and empty silences that scream louder than words. The infused serious gravitas was not even conceived through Morita's relationship with Macchio. Rather, it was the warm, authentically flowing response that he had. He listened, he reacted, he guided, and slowly Macchio leaned into him as though he were someone he could trust. That would be the first indication of a partnership to anchor the entire franchise. The producers could see it, but they needed more before committing. The 4th test added costumes. Would Morita be able to look like it? In a very simple GI with his beard and hair signifying features, he changed completely. The nightclub comic or sitcom regular was gone. Shaped by age, experience, and quiet pain, in his place stood a man. Even Ralph later admitted that when Pat dressed as Miyagi, the transformation was startling. It was as if he became character. But, in the end, studio heads wanted guarantees beyond guarantees. The fifth and final test was the clincher. They called for a reading on a cold, empty sound stage. No sets, no props, just Marita, Macchio, and the camera. It was the ultimate in stress testing. Was there still magic under the most extreme conditions? The answer was quick in coming. The two interacted as if doing so was second nature. Marita did not act. He inhabited Miyagi. Macchio did not deliver lines. He was responding to a mentor who seemed very real. When the camera stopped, the silence was deafening. 5 auditions had not only proved that he could act. They proved he was Miyagi in a way none could even begin to match. It had been quite a trial, but it created something everlasting. After that, Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita were no longer co-stars. Ralph and Pat became Daniel and Miyagi, bonded forever by a chemistry that transcended generations. The 5 flawless tests had proved Marita was Miyagi, but it took one phone call from the toughest skeptic to finally seal his fate. The call that flipped the room when Pat Morita finally cleared the obstacle course of auditions, screen tests, and chemistry reads. There was still one lingering shadow, Jerry Weintraub. The powerful producer had been the wall that nearly kept Marita out of The Karate Kid. He didn't want a comedian in the role. He didn't trust that Pat could deliver the weight and gravitas of a mentor figure. For weeks, Marita's future had dangled on the edge of Weintraub's doubt. Then came the phone call that flipped the room. It happened after the 5th test when Marita and Ralph Macchio, in costume, performed in front of the studio heads. It wasn't a flashy scene with karate kicks or sweeping music. It was a quiet exchange. Miyagi speaking with Daniel in that clipped, halting rhythm Pat had shaped out of exhaustion and instinct. Daniel answered not as an actor reading lines, but as a boy leaning into the wisdom of someone who seemed to care. The stillness of it carried more weight than any action sequence ever could. Avildsen, confident as ever, let the camera roll. He had been Marita's champion from the beginning, fighting for his inclusion, keeping his tape in circulation, replaying the footage whenever Weintraub grew dismissive. Now, in front of a full room, Marita and Macchio were undeniable. When the test ended, there was no laughter, no skepticism, just silence. A silence heavy enough to tip the balance. Weintraub picked up the phone. On the other end was Marita, waiting at home, still unsure if the role he had poured himself into would slip away. Weintraub didn't waste words. His voice, usually sharp and unyielding, carried a different weight now. Pat, he said, I almost made the worst mistake of my life. I just want to be the first to congratulate you. You've got the part of Miyagi. Marita had wanted that job for personal redemption, announcing to the world in utter defiance. Not a comedian, not Marita. It was the man opposing him who now had to eat his words. In one phone call, the tide turned, and the entire balance of power in the production shifted. The room that had once looked down at him was now standing up in respect. Pat would say he felt triumph and humility all at once. He had not raised his voice, bragged, or pointed out how close they had come to excluding him. With an inner sense of pride, he had simply accepted the role. He knew that this victory meant so much more than just his own career. Miyagi was much more than a character. He was destined to be a cultural icon. Though it was in some way a pivot for Marita, it was more of that for the film. With the co-casting of Miyagi, production happened to be tied up. Ralph Macchio had his mentor by heart was John Avildsen, and in honor, Jerry Weintraub had the guts to admit when wrong to himself. Much sweeter was the victory for Pat because it was tough. For him, the part was not handed to him. He had to scramble through a lot of doubt. Now, he could wear Mr. Miyagi's shoes for the first time with all the force his worth could muster, with Weintraub's words ringing in his ear.